Hello and welcome to MusicEL Pathways, the podcast which focuses on the different pathways musicians take in order to reach their musical goals. And today we're going to be talking to another teacher here at MusicEL so that you can get to know us all a bit better. Our guest today is a master of the keys and Cornwall's first call for all things jazz. As one of the long-standing leaders of the Cornwall Youth Jazz Orchestra, he's had the opportunity to play throughout the county and beyond, along with teaching at Cornwall Music Service Trust. He's now joined us here at MusicEL, teaching the Jazz Bike syllabus, along with much more to come, I'm sure. The one and only Mr. Andy Bilham. How's it going, Andy?
I'm great, thanks, Gary. Good to be here.
As I said at the top, we're going to look at the ways in which you've developed your skills in order to reach your goals of becoming a professional musician. And while doing that, we're going to take some stops at some of the opportunities which music's given you along the way. The first question I ask everyone, though, is how was music a part of your life as a child? So what role did music play for you in the early years?
My dad was musical. My mum patently, obviously, wasn't. But I started playing the piano at the age of 6. We lived in Hale at the time, and I went down the road to an old lady, Mrs. Rickard, and I learnt there for a couple of years until we moved to Redruth. And fortunately for me, about 50 yards up the road from where we moved to was Mrs. Nettle. Her son, David Nettle, is a world-renowned concert pianist, and he's one of the very few pairs of pianists. Him and I can't remember what his sort of musical partner's name is, but they tour the world performing on 2 pianos. But it's classical. But David was, I suppose, 4 or 5 years older than me. Still is. And his mum taught from her front room, and I stayed with Mrs. Nettle, I suppose, from the age of 8 to about the age of 14. And then I had lessons for a couple of years from my music teacher at school, Hunter Skinner. And then I moved to Truro. Well, my lessons moved to Truro. Yeah. And I had lessons with Mrs. Hoadley, who is the mum of Ben Hoadley, cello teacher with Cornwall Music Service Trust. It's full of these little circles, aren't they, connections.
I think that's a thing with music in general, isn't it? You know, like you know someone who knows someone who does something with someone else. Like it's one of the like kind of ingressed part of music in our lives.
Exactly, it is. Only couple of days ago, I announced that I knew somebody, and then somebody completely unconnected said, "Oh, I didn't realise I knew you both," and away it goes again. So and that was a musical connection as well. So yeah, there are these little concentric circles that run through every aspect of music. So there we are.
It sounds like you had a lot of instrument teachers, though. It sounds like you had a few piano teachers along the way.
Yeah.
So did you kind of grab bits from each of them?
Oh, I'm sure I did. It's one of those things that you're not really aware of when you're learning. Yeah. You're just learning. But certainly different practice methods, different teaching methods as well. As I say, you're not aware of it at the time. You're just going for a piano lesson. But looking back in years later, I realised that yes, they all taught slightly differently, and somehow got the best from me.
I was going to say, I kind of think that having that diversity in your teaching, though, makes you a more well-rounded musician, because they're all going to focus on a different part. And that's going to generally make you a better musician in all those little parts, kind of round you off.
I absolutely agree. I've had pupils in the past who've been rather apologetic about having lessons with me and with somebody else. I think it's a great thing, to be honest, because you get 2 different takes on the same instrument, and one take may end up being better for you, or you might, gain insights into your instrument in two different ways from two different teachers. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing.
No, I think it's a great thing.
I was going to say that playing the piano is a very lonely thing. I suppose I discovered this fairly early on, when I was still in single figures. So my parents suggested that I started learning the violin. I'm not sure why the violin over any other instrument.
Well, it's classic instruments, isn't it?
Well, it is, yes. And of course, that opened the door to a lot more social music making. You, as a pianist, you tend not to. It's a sort of a solo instrument. So I was fortunate enough to, obviously I played in the school orchestra, but I also played in the Falmouth Youth Orchestra, and after that, the Cornwall Youth Orchestra, CYO, which of course is still going strong, all these years later. And that was brilliant.
It's quite amazing, actually, when you think about it, isn't it? It's amazing that it's just stuck around.
Exactly. And the youth orchestra, we're talking in the early 1970s when I joined it, I suppose 73, 74, age 13, 14. There you are. Do the maths. I've just told you how old I am. That was fantastic because I've made friends in the youth orchestra, some of whom are still teaching colleagues with CMST, and others that I'm still in contact with all over the world. So, that really brought the social side of music making into my life, and I shall always be grateful for that.
You don't actually think about it as an outsider looking at someone playing piano, how lonely that could be, I guess. I mean, we're all lonely during practice because that is a at-home by-yourself thing for the most part. I mean, there's band and group practicing as well, but for the most part, you're doing it by yourself. But actually, piano goes all the way up to performance by yourself a lot of the times. I mean, there's lots of other options, but you just don't. I don't think about it as a guitarist because I've always practiced in groups. Like,
yeah,
I've always had bands and other groups that I play with, Yeah. So, it's an interesting point, actually, one that hasn't come up yet. But you are our first piano player, so it does make sense.
Right.
What was your first performance then? Was it with one of those orchestras, or did you perform with your just piano first?
I mean, obviously, I went through the Associated Board graded piano exams, but I don't really think you can class those as performances. I mean, technically, I suppose they were.
Not really, no.
But Mrs. Nettle, my piano teacher in Redruth, was very keen to enter us for local music festivals, and in particular the St Austell Music Festival. And I think the first time that I played, I must have been, I've been trying to work it out, knowing that this question was likely to come up. I think I must have been about 10. I think I was still at primary school, so it must have been 9 or 10.
Yeah.
And, of course, Redruth to St Austell in the 1960s, 1970, there was no fast roads. And I know that my class at the old Capitol Theatre in St Austell, which is where the music festival was held. I don't even know whether that exists anymore, whether it's probably been either pulled down or turned into flats.
Yeah, I think it's been converted.
Right. We had to leave stupidly early in the morning from Redruth to get to St Austell in time, and I know that we really cut it to the wire, to the extent that as we walked into the auditorium, my name was being called, and my mum literally sort of grabbed my coat, grabbed it by the collar, and I just walked on, and she pulled it off, and then threw my music bag at me, my little leather music case, and almost without breaking stride, I just walked straight up on stage, played my piece, and before I knew it, I'd finished.
I mean, you're not going to be as nervous doing that, at least.
No, absolutely not.
No chance for it. Just straight in there.
So but that was it. And I think we probably walked around St Austell and then called it a day, and we were home by lunchtime. Anyway, about 5:30 that night, the doorbell went, and I was called to the door, and there's this chap there with this huge, great cardboard box, and he said, "Oh, this is for you." And I said, "What?" Just didn't understand. So he opened the box and took out, well, to me as a 10-year-old, this enormous silver cup. And it was the Forrester Cup, which I won for the best piano performance of the day.
That's not bad for your first performance.
Well, I still reckon that it's because I didn't have the chance to get nervous. And it was all about getting onto the stage without tripping over. Got my music out and got the nod to say, yes, you can start. And I'd played the piece before I'd even registered where I was or what I was doing. I bet
that made a big impact onto your next performances as well. So, like, were you less nervous from then on? Because when you did your first one, you didn't have a chance to be nervous, and you won. It must have put you in a position where nerves were less likely.
I don't know. I've always been nervous, and I say to, I'm sure you have, Gary, performed thousands of times.
Yeah.
And I always say to young children, especially, I mean, a lot of my teaching, well, the majority of my teaching is in primary schools, and they're all hyped up and feeling nervous and experiencing sensations in their body that they're not used to. And I said, look, don't worry, because I'm feeling exactly the same. The only difference is I know how to channel that, and you don't. You haven't learnt that yet. Don't worry, just go in there, take a few deep breaths, slow everything down, and go for it and enjoy it. I think that's, the number of times that I've seen musicians from 8 to 80 go wrong, audiences sort of don't mind.
No.
They would rather somebody shows their sort of their human side. We're not just machines that produce perfect performances. Audiences are on your side. And if you go wrong and then pick things up and move on, they'll forget. And I very often say to pupils, as long as the beginning and the ending are okay, you can sort of get away with almost anything in the middle. The beginning sets the scene in your audience's head, and they'll remember the last thing that you do. So, work on the beginning and the ending of the piece a little more, just to make sure that you get a confident start, which settles you, and a confident ending, which is the thing that the audience is going to remember.
Yeah, and I think the same goes. I think the same goes for even like a set list or a group of songs. You put your best one, like a good one at the beginning, and a good ending one, and the middle ones don't. Like, they still want to be good, but as long as those two are good, people will go. They will listen to the whole thing, and then they will go away thinking that was a really great performance, which is your kind of main kind of bread and butter, I guess.
Exactly.
You also brought up a great thing about worrying. And my daughter watches this movie, so this will be for everyone who's got a young child. And one of the things they say in the movie is, if you never worry, then you aren't living, right? So without worrying, you aren't thinking about your current situation. So I think it rings true there as well. If you've not got a bit of fright in you, you're not going to do your best performance because you're not living in that exact moment. And like you say, you just have to channel it. That's
right. You need that little bit of extra sort of mental energy, that little bit of adrenaline coursing around your body to heighten your reactions and your sense. I worry sometimes if I'm performing and I don't feel nervous. I almost get more worried about that than I do about the performance itself.
You get a bit complacent, don't you? You just like, and you're just going to make a mistake because you're not really thinking about it. There's songs that I know I've played, like, in a year I probably play 100 times, and I never really think about them. And the moment And sometimes it's the opposite, that if I start thinking about them, I just lose the whole song. so there's definitely a balancing act between that, when you've played a song a lot of times. So along those lines, what's the performance which sticks out to you? What was your biggest and best performance in your eyes?
I've been giving this some serious thought, Gary. And it's
a hard one.
It is so difficult. I mean, almost in every decade of my life, there's probably been a performance which has stood out for me.
I mean, you don't have to pick one.
Well, in different situations and in different contexts and different styles. Because I mean, although I tend to play jazz these days, I haven't always, and I've performed classical and acted as an accompanist and all that sort of stuff. When I finished my music degree or my performing arts degree, I ended up working for a travelling theatre company based in Loughborough. And we travelled all over the country, and I was sort of musician first and actor second.
Okay.
One of the performances that I remember all those years ago, and this would have been in my mid-20s, one of my roles was as a dancing gorilla. Yeah, I know. Full gorilla suit. And I suddenly realised that I could get away with blue murder. A, because people find the concept of a gorilla running up the road bizarre and hopefully funny. But also they have,
I mean, there's no other way of taking it, is there?
Isn't, no.
if you don't take that as funny.
But the great thing is that nobody knows who's inside the gorilla suit. And we parked our brightly coloured transit van in a little side street, and I sort of emerged from this undercover. Nobody happened to be walking past at the time. So I was running up. We were in Clonbrindod Wells in mid Wales for a weekly festival. I think it's a Victorian festival.
Right.
So all the shopkeepers are dressed up in Victorian shopkeepers' garb, and the ladies have got their long crinolines on, and the gents are walking around with top hats and three-piece suits. I mean, it's a wonderful atmosphere.
I was going to say, there's still a place that does that in Wales, isn't there?
I think the festival is still
a little
going.
Village.
Yeah, well, I think Clonbrindod Wells is their festival is still running after all these years.
Right.
So I was walking up to greengrocers and running off with a hand of bananas, obviously to drop them back later. I was stopping the traffic and generally, if you'll pardon the pun, aping around. And I went back into the van, complete with bananas, changed out of my gorilla suit, put my normal clothes back on, walked back up to the shopkeeper in question who I'd stolen the bananas from, and he just looked at me as if I said, I better let you have these back. And he said, sorry? I said, well, I took these a few minutes ago. And I said, I was in the gorilla suit. Oh, it was you. And it was at that moment I thought, I can do whatever I want to here, because nobody, you think everybody can see you, but of course they can't because you've got the mask on. And from that moment on, but it was that particular day in that particular outfit that I realised that, you are undercover, and that was fantastic. I just had so much fun that week doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things.
That's actually something that a lot of musicians do as well, in that they put a facade over themselves. Yes. They've got a persona on stage, such as Ziggy Stardust, Ozzy Osbourne, and even Lady Gaga now. Yeah. And they put on this persona that isn't them, but that allows them to act out and play the musician role, to do what they're doing on stage.
Absolutely. And I've noticed this more in recent years. I mean, one of the things that I get great pleasure from is I work with a small select band of they don't realise it, but they are extremely talented adults. And we have a little community samba band based just outside Camborne. and for my sins, I sort of point them in the right direction and help them along the way. But, one of the reasons that I enjoy it so much is we have a great laugh, and they're a lovely bunch of people. There's about sort of 12, 14 of them. They make a great sound. And we go off and we do carnivals and fetes and various other performances. And I've noticed that when I'm up the front leading, that I am a different person. And I've noticed this from being in an audience, that when you are watching, especially outdoor sort of informal performance, you're not looking at the person that's performing, you're listening to what they're playing. And you can get away with an awful lot more when you're not being yourself. You're being that guy up the front who's trying to encourage everybody to clap or to dance, or not showing off, but trying to convey the atmosphere, the mood of the music to your audience.
Yeah, I mean, it's called a stage show for a reason.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's a performance. The whole thing as a whole. I mean, I know as a child, I suffered really badly. I was very, very shy. I know some people who in my primary school I talk to now, and they're like, I don't really remember you being there. And I was so shy. Yeah. And then music made me not shy, and I am far from that now. But I think it was that performance thing, that putting on the different face really allowed me to blend into that band and increase my confidence. And I think it's exactly what you're saying there. I think it's a really beautiful part of music, is that it allows you to develop your whole self.
Absolutely.
Along with putting on this little performance at the front. Do you enjoy the performances the most about music? Is that your kind of keen interest in music, or is there another part that grabs your interest the most?
I like the notion of being able to convey an emotion.
Yeah.
Whether that's sort of abandonment and happiness and dancing, or whether it's something a little more deep. It's funny, one of the performances that I remember best was 5-6 years ago. I was asked to provide a little bit of jazz for a concert that St Mary's Singers in Truro were doing at Trelissick House.
Yeah.
Between Falmouth and Truro, down on the River Fowle. So I had a drummer and a bass player with me who I've played with quite a few times before. They know how I play, I know how they play.
Yeah.
And because we weren't the main attraction, the singers would sing for 20 minutes, we would play for 10 minutes, they sang, and then I think the same happened in the second half. I think we kicked things off, they sang, we played again, and then they sang to finish. So we played, I suppose, 6 or 7 tunes in the whole of the concert, and it was one of those very few occasions. I think it was partly because the audience were sat on blankets with their picnics, so there was a nice sort of, music in the park feel. They weren't breathing down my neck. I suppose the nearest members of the audience were probably 20 meters away, something like that.
Yeah.
We were relaxed, we were comfortable, and it was just a pleasure to play. And because the pressure of performing sort of lifted, I personally felt that I played really well. And I thought that, the three of us melded together, worked really well. And I'm pleased to say that I had quite a few compliments afterwards. But it was one of those gigs that for me just worked. And, that I really enjoyed as a consequence.
So that was more of a focus on people developing their emotional contact with the music. That's the bit you like.
Yeah.
And you tend to find that if people come up and compliment you, then they have connected with it in a way as well. And so you definitely know that's
absolutely
happened. People don't go out of their way to compliment musicians unless they really feel like they need to.
Yes, you do. I mean, you don't think, well, that was rubbish, but I'll go and tell them how good they were.
Yeah,
No.
yeah. And equally, like, even if you think, that was good, you might not go up and tell them. But if you've got this feeling in yourself that it was amazing, then you need to tell them. Do you know what I mean? It's that you have to reach above the bar. It has to be above good.
Yes.
I've said it before, but I say this to my students: if they're writing or playing something and they just think it's good, well, everyone else might just think it's okay, and then some people might think it's rubbish. But if you think it's amazing, some people are going to think it's amazing, some people are going to think it's good, and then the rest of them are going to think it's okay, which is perfectly fine, but you're going to have way less people on the bottom of that scale. But have you got any tips you always tell your students? So I always tell mine about that good scale. What's the tip that your most common one you tell everyone?
Bearing in mind that my weekly teaching is the majority, as I've mentioned before, is primary. Yeah. I feel that my job is to give them a good solid grounding. Hopefully by the time they move on to secondary school and maybe tertiary education, that they've got that good grounding that they can use to build on. So my tips are fairly basic, if you like, but I think
that's not a bad thing, though.
But no, absolutely.
Everyone starts at the bottom, so you can only go up. So I'm sure it'll be relevant.
As I'm sure you're only too aware, the most important thing I feel for young kids is to get into the practice habit. Yeah. And it's the most difficult to encourage, because you're asking. It's one of those things that until you've practiced for 10 minutes a day for 2 weeks, you won't notice the difference.
No.
And
no.
you can say that to somebody as many times as you like, but what you've got to do is to actually get them practicing regularly, and then they notice and they think, oh, I've got better. Why's that happened? Well, it's happened because I've been practicing. So if I practice a bit more, does that mean I'll get better? Oh, yes, it does. And then they're away.
Yeah.
So I try to sort of conduct my lessons in the way that I would like them to practice, that maybe we'll go over 4 bars of a piece 8 times, and we'll stop and talk about it and what do you find difficult. Okay, so break it down, hands separately, and then put the hands back together. Slowing down, which for a young player is sort of the last thing they want to do, because they just want to be able to play it fast, especially the boys. Yeah. Girls are a little bit more reflective about these things, and when they've got that sorted, then it's sort of looking at the whole piece, which is the bit that you can't play. Okay, work on that bit first.
And that's something that they avoid a lot. They'll play the bit that they can play many times, and then they'll rush over the little bit they don't know so well, and then they'll play the next bit they can play, because it feels like they're more accomplished then in their minds. But really, they need to know that that's the bit they need to look at, is that little bit that they're avoiding. But it's just good. It's just good practice technique, isn't it?
Well, it is. It is. And if I think back to my childhood, Gary, I can think of thousands of times when I was that same child that you've just described, that will play the bits 100%. That they can play. Yeah. It's just breaking that sort of breaking that tendency to avoid the tricky bits, and say to them, look, if you master that tricky bit, you've mastered the whole piece, rather than the beginning and the end and that bit in the middle that's not so good. You've then got the whole piece. And it's just trying to instill these basic principles of good practice, pun intended, so that they take that through. And very often, I can remember back in the 1990s, I had, because I teach a bit of drum kit as well, and always have, I had a 14-year-old lad recommended to me for drum lessons from the head of music at a school I was teaching in Hertfordshire, Sir John Law's School in Harpenden. And this lad came to me and he was a bit sort of, not sort of really almost there because he was told to be there rather than because he wanted to be.
Yeah, yeah.
So he came to me in year 9, so he would have been about 14.
Which is the age where they're all like that anyway.
Exactly.
Better things to do.
Exactly. By the age of 18, he was the drummer with the National Youth Jazz Orchestra. Now, I'm not taking all the credit for that by any means, but I was in the staff room at this school about 4 weeks after Darren started, and his geography teacher, who I knew well through school band trips abroad, and Chris and I had spent a long time together, and he said, "You've started teaching Darren, haven't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I know." I said, "What do you mean you know?" He said, "You should see his latest geography homework that he's handed in." He said, "It is so much better than anything he's ever produced for me before." And Darren, that sort of first drum lesson must have been the catalyst, because he realised that if he worked hard at his drumming, he got better, and he wanted to get better, so he carried on practicing. And then thought, well, if I work hard at my geography, then I can, at the age of 14, I don't think any of his teachers would have expected him to stay into the 6th form, which he did, and got 3 A levels. And I put it all down to his starting his drum lessons with me.
Yeah, it's like a life skill, isn't it? Being able to do that, and like you say, it's quite quickly overlooked. I think, especially in England as a whole, probably not Western culture, but in England, music's overlooked in its power to develop your ability to work hard. Essentially, I mean,
sadly,
I think China.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I think China have got it. Like they teach music all the way from a young age, and then people wonder why they get such good grades. It's like, well, there's a bit of correlation here that is quite obvious, and that's a really amazing story, really, because it obviously changed his entire life, and it was just like you say, that one little catalyst that the head teacher was wise enough to go, that is what you need to do right now, and it will change everything. And I think it's that's just one of those great bits at the end. I mean, I'm not saying you did everything. Obviously, he took a lot into his own hands, but
and it could just as easily have been needlework or rugby or
exactly
abseiling. It could have. It was just something that flicked a switch with this young teenager, and he realised, well, I can apply that right across the board. I mean, I'm delighted to say that he now runs his own recording studio in his hometown of Harpenden.
Cool.
And he regularly records some of the top players in the country.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. And, he's in his, what's Darren now? He must be in his late 40s. And still doing it, still playing, and, spending an awful lot of his time with some of the top players in the country. So,
that's
good on you, Darren.
That's great. Yeah. No, that is amazing. And I think we'll kind of come around to my last question that I've asked everyone, just because we've kind of gone through a good portion of your life now, Andy. But now as an adult, what effect does music have in your everyday life now? Now you've gone through that practicing and developing and become the musician you are.
I still get huge pleasure from practicing, but I still get huge pleasure from performing as well. And people say, well, don't you find primary school it must be very restricting? They're just wonderful. They're like little sponges, and you pour in a litre of information every week, and they come back, and most of them have still got 90% of it in their heads the next week. And they're moldable at that age, and if you can mold them in the right ways, and set them up before you pass them up the ladder, it's an absolute privilege to be in that position. And I just love working with primary children because they're massively funny, sometimes unintentionally.
They are good. They've got a good sense of humour. Good sense of humour.
Absolutely. And I love it. I mean, obviously, I still direct the County Youth Jazz Orchestra, and I teach jazz improvisation to mid-teenagers, and I get a huge amount of pleasure from that as well, because they're there because they want to learn, and I can hopefully introduce them to some of the secrets, with air quotes. They're not secrets, but sometimes they feel like they are. Just introduce them to the idea of improvising and spontaneous creation of a musical line, and that's probably the bit of teaching that I enjoy most, but it's the bit that I do very little of, which is a bit of a shame, but that's the way it goes.
Well, hopefully post coronavirus that won't be the case.
Let's hope so.
Do a bit more of it.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, I'm always listening to music. My daughter, who's in her 20s now, she's a musician, and she's currently in the middle of a music degree. And almost every day, she'll send me a couple of YouTube links or a playlist or something, and I do the same thing. So we're always sharing stuff, and I'm always learning new stuff and raving about a new artist or a new band or a new style of music. So I don't think you ever stop learning in this life, certainly not in something that is as massive as music.
No. And I will ask one more question, because I have been asking a few people this. What is the artist that you've just listened to then? What song's just kind of gone past your ears and you've had a second listen to?
Funnily enough, over breakfast this morning, because my wife went off to work early, so I treated myself to a bit of YouTube over breakfast. I don't do every day. I listened to the most wonderful group of African drummers from the Malinke tribe, who were performing in their village and had been filmed by a couple of French musicologists who were in the region and just got their phones out and videoed them.
Wow.
And then stuck it up on YouTube. So probably not the sort of thing you were expecting me to say, oh yes, I've just listened to a whole Charlie Parker album or been transcribing a Bill Evans solo. No, it was a group of sort of native Malinke drummers from Central Africa.
That's so cool, though, isn't it? Like that you can appreciate something so wildly different from your world, and I think
absolutely
it's been quite cool. I've been listening to some of the suggestions people have been giving me on here. It's definitely, I listen to a lot of I thought I listened to a lot of varied music. That's probably the best way of putting it. But then, someone will recommend you something, and they're massive. Like they're a huge artist, but they've just never crossed my pathway, if you like. And I think it's amazing.
Here's my little recommendation for you then, Gary. Obviously, I teach samba, both to primary school children and to adults. And I feel that if you're teaching a music from a different culture, I think jazz is slightly different because although it's an Afro-American style originally, I think now it's a global style. And, there's some great jazz players from all over the world. Yeah. Thank goodness. But obviously samba is not of our culture. And I think it's really important that if you are teaching music from a different culture, that you do it properly, that you teach it and you teach it authentically, and that you can back up your musical teaching with a bit of social history and a bit of sort of a bit of background, so that it's not just that bloke that comes in and we play some samba stuff, but that they know it comes from Brazil and they know why it happens and how it's developed and the links between Brazil and Africa,
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
etc., etc.
That makes sense.
And of course, there is a whole world of music in Brazil which is hugely rhythmic, which we in the West or in the UK perhaps are not aware of. So my little recommendation, they're a great band. They were based in Rio, and they're called Fundo de Quintal.
Go on, spell it.
And Fundo, Fundo, de Quintal, Quintal, so quintal,
right,
if you like,
yeah.
but it's pronounced Quintal. And it means at the bottom of my garden. Fundo, bottom, Quintal is sort of backyard.
Yeah.
And the reason they called that is when they started, they rehearsed in a little hut at the bottom of one of the members' back gardens because it was convenient and they had the space. I mean, they're massive. You go to a Fundo de Quintal concert and the whole audience know all the words to all the songs.
Yeah.
They are Brazilian classics. And very often they'll play the intro to a song and start singing, but they're just completely swamped by the sound of, quite a few hundred people in the audience all singing along at the top of their voices. Very listenable, lovely sort of melodic and interesting harmonic music, but, very easy to listen to. Full of Brazilian influence, full of samba influence, if you know what you're listening for. Yeah. And just a great band. So there you are. There's my little suggestion.
Yeah.
Fundo de Quintal.
I'll check them out, and hopefully whoever's listening will also check them out.
I hope so.
We'll sign off now anyway. So I hope whoever's listening has also gained a bit of inspiration to go grab their instrument and have a play. And remember, every path leads to a goal eventually. So why not take them all? Until next time, bye.
Thanks. Bye.